Caleb Morris, a 41-year-old veteran, limped past the old bus stop with a knee that never healed and a silence he carried home from war. He thought he was alone in his emptiness until he saw Tommy, a small boy raising 3 trembling fingers behind the shelter. In that instant the war flared inside him again, and he knew, some battles aren't fought overseas, but in the quiet streets of a town that pretends to be safe. Caleb Morris came back to his small town in early autumn. The streets felt both familiar and faded, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Wind pressed down the row of brick houses, carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's backyard. He leaned on a cane whose handle had worn smooth, his left knee aching with each step, the sound of metal tapping pavement echoing slow, steady, heavy. His apartment sat on the second floor of an aging building. A narrow window faced the bus stop, once busy, now worn down. The notice board tilted, its paint chipped away, iron benches streaked with rust bled into the concrete. To passers-by it was nothing but a shabby corner. But for Caleb, it was a reminder carved deep, convoys rolling out of base, engines growling, dust rising like a storm, comrades sitting rigid, their eyes locked on a horizon that swallowed them whole. Now there was only a few townsfolk waiting quietly for their rides, and the wind circling, whispering echoes of a life gone. Inside, the silence was heavier. He hung his coat on a crooked nail. The table had one chair. The refrigerator hummed with its hollow inventory, cans of soup, lined painkillers. The wall clock ticked slow, every second falling like a stone against his chest. Most nights Caleb sat in a sagging wooden chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the wind seep through the window cracks, cold and endless. There were nights he woke drenched in sweat. The explosions came back, sudden and sharp, the shattering noise of artillery burning into dreams. He'd open his eyes wide, staring into the dark, afraid that he would never escape. That fear crept in quiet as breath, the fear that tomorrow, next year, a decade later, he would still be stuck between two worlds, one that had ended, and one that had never truly begun. Yet when dawn's pale light pressed through the yellowed curtain, Caleb still stood. He gripped the cane hard, pulled in a deep breath, and stepped down the groaning stairs. His knee shook, but he refused to fall. At the bus stop, he watched a bus leave, no one looking back, no one noticing. In that stillness, he recognized that resilience did not come from great battles, but from small choices, to walk though it hurt, to face though afraid, to breathe though memories tore at him. The past stayed, like a scar that never healed. But by walking past the bus stop each day, he reminded himself the past could not rule the rest of his life. And perhaps, in that fragile rhythm, a new kind of courage was beginning. Caleb slowly learned how to manage the ordinary. Each morning he opened the fridge, pulled out a can of soup, poured it into a small pot. The faint hiss of it heating filled the quiet kitchen, covering the silence pressing in. He spooned it down not because it tasted good, but because it was simple, the easiest way to keep the body moving. Beside the stove, a dull tin box lined with painkillers sat waiting. Every pill, every can of soup, became the rhythm by which his days were measured. Outside the window, the town carried on. Children ran toward school, backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Adults hurried down Main Street where a faded American flag still clung to the storefront. The sounds of living engines starting, dogs barking, church bells striking, rose together in a tune Caleb could only listen to, never join. He watched them through the dusty glass, feeling like a shadow with shape but no place. In the afternoons he walked the street, his cane tapping out a steady knock against the pavement. Sometimes he stepped into the corner store to buy another can of soup or bottled water. The clerk recognized him, nodded politely, but never asked more. Those brief exchanges, money laid on the counter, groceries in a paper sack, only deepened the distance between him and the world. At night the apartment folded into darkness again. Caleb switched on a yellow desk lamp, its dim circle falling across the warped floorboards. His cane stood in the corner, casting a rigid shadow that seemed to stare back at him, a reminder of what he'd lost. He looked at it too long, as though measuring the cost of being incomplete. With each glance, fear rose, fear that this missing part would keep him forever behind, forever apart. Sometimes he tried writing in a small notebook. The pen trembled, words broke off halfway, sentences refused to take shape. Blank spaces filled more pages than ink did. He shut the book, set it down, and fixed his eyes on the wall clock. The second hand crawled forward, so slow it felt like time itself was worn out. In that suspended stillness, Caleb understood he wasn't living, only existing. And that realization weighed heavier than any dream of war. Yet instead of running from it, he stayed, letting the fear crest and fall. Sometimes endurance itself, sitting with it, refusing to move away, was the first step toward a different kind of resilience. That evening the sun spilled across the sidewalk in long faded streaks, the color of an old photograph. Caleb moved past the bus stop, cane tapping, as he often did when he wanted only to watch time slide by. The rusted benches caught the dying light, the leaning notice board wavered in the breeze. He was about to turn back when something made him freeze. A boy no more than 7 stood pressed against the far side of the shelter. Thin shoulders, a worn backpack hanging loose. He turned slightly away, but behind his back a small hand lifted. 3 fingers raised, quick, trembling, like a signal meant to stay hidden. Beside him stood a woman in her 40s. Blonde hair pulled neatly back, white blouse, dark jeans. She spoke easily with a neighbor, her smile practiced, her posture tidy. To anyone else she looked like a picture of trust, a mother attentive. But Caleb's eyes weren't on her face. They were locked on that hand. 3 fingers. Brief. Subtle. A sign impossible to mistake. Years earlier, in a rescue mission overseas, children had used it in silence from inside a boarded house. A signal that brought them out alive. Now, here, in the quiet of an American town, it returned urgent, desperate, without a word. Blood rushed to Caleb's temples, his heartbeat hammering faster. He tried to take a step forward, his knee jolting with pain, forcing him to stop. For a second the boy turned, his eyes catching Caleb's, dark, waited, pleading. Then the woman's hand clamped around the child's wrist and pulled him away in haste. In that instant, the world blurred. The bus engine roared, voices called down the street, yet all of it fell behind. What remained burned in his mind was the tremor of that small hand. Caleb stood rigid, chest heaving, war memories rising sharp and uninvited. He knew this wasn't a child's game. It couldn't be. When their figures vanished around the corner, Caleb still hadn't moved. Pain in his knee pinned him, his grip whitening on the cane. And underneath the ache came another fear, colder, heavier, that if he stayed still too long, the boy would vanish like others he'd once failed to reach. That fear, he realized, was more than memory. It was a summons, an unspoken order, that he could not turn away from. The moment was brief. So brief another passerby might have dismissed it, but to Caleb it cut like a blade across memory. The boy's eyes, wide yet heavy, locked onto his. There were no tears, no sound, only silence pressed tight, weary, urgent, like a cry smothered before it could escape. In that gaze Caleb saw again the faces of children he'd once stumbled upon in smoke and rubble, eyes he had carried through the years of war, eyes that followed him even into sleep, wrenching him awake in sweat and dread. Then it was gone. The woman's hand yanked hard, pulling the child along. The boy's steps, small, hurried, stumbling, spoke of no choice, no freedom. The sight struck against Caleb's chest, his heartbeat quickening, pounding like the old alarms of combat. Everything else dimmed, the bus rumbling away, the murmur of voices, all of it receded. What stayed was a child dragged from view, swallowed by the corner of the street. He stood there long, fingers tightening around his cane until his knuckles whitened. Part of him wanted to follow, but his body resisted, locked in place by pain and the weight of memory. That gaze would not let him go. It threaded through each breath, each pulse, asking a question with no easy answer: if you turn away now, will you repeat the same failure? Even after the two figures had vanished, Caleb remained rooted. The pavement beneath him seemed longer, colder, stretched into distance. In his mind, old scenes returned: a child crouched behind rubble in Syria, clutching a stone, an orphan huddled in the back of a military truck, staring without blinking. Those eyes, though from another world, now overlapped perfectly with the ones at the bus stop here, in the supposed peace of America. He realized the silence of those eyes carried more weight than any explosion he had ever known. It terrified him, not the war itself, but the possibility of being powerless again, of letting it pass, of carrying another unhealed scar for the rest of his life. And yet, within that fear, something else stirred, an invisible cord pulling him upright, breath fast but steadier, resolve beginning to harden. Caleb knew something was wrong. And this time, he could not turn away. The next day Caleb carried the old binoculars, once used for birdwatching, now pressed into another kind of duty. He chose a wooden bench near the park, far enough not to draw attention, close enough to watch the houses by the bus stop. His cane leaned against his leg, his palm damp with sweat, the moment carrying the feel of reconnaissance again. Through the foggy lens, shapes sharpened. The woman, neatly dressed, blouse pressed, held the boy's hand. Yet it wasn't guiding, it was binding. Her grip was firm, pulling the child forward too quickly for such small legs. Caleb saw him stumble, then scramble to catch up, short steps hurried and uneven. That afternoon Caleb trailed them to a row of housing behind the stop. The small house drew its curtains tight. But in a narrow gap, he caught the sight of a tiny hand clutching the fabric. It didn't wave, didn't beckon, only held gripped as if it were the last thread binding the boy to the outside world. The image cut deep. In war zones Caleb had seen children pressed against barred windows, staring out through slits in steel. Sometimes he reached them, but often he was too late. And too late had followed him ever since. He left the park as dusk fell, his shadow stretching across the uneven pavement, a reflection of a man no longer whole. His heartbeat raced, not from the pain in his knee, but from the conviction that he was witnessing a truth smothered behind curtains. That night he sat at his desk, switching on the yellow lamp, opening a small notebook. Pages once empty filled now with notes, the hours they left the house, the sharp tugs of her hand, the closed door, the car parked too still. His handwriting shook, but the lines took shape, one after another. He understood he was no longer a bystander. He had crossed into watchfulness, deliberate, consuming. Outside, the wind slid cold through the window frame. Caleb glanced at his cane in the corner, then back to the notebook. He wrote one more sentence, heavy as a vow, never too late again. The next morning Caleb slid the photographs into a worn envelope. They were blurred, some shaken by his unsteady hand, yet clear enough, the boy clutching the strap of his backpack, the wary eyes, the woman's grip too tight. He carried them to the small security office, fluorescent lights humming, the air heavy with the smell of stale coffee. A young officer sat behind a desk, flipping through reports, listening only halfway. Caleb placed the envelope down, his fingers trembling but his gaze steady. The officer pulled the photos out, frowned, then exhaled, not enough evidence. The boy might just be shy. Maybe he doesn't like holding hands. The words fell flat, like a door slammed shut. Caleb kept his composure, but inside his chest hammered. He had heard those same phrases years ago in war, no order. Can't move. And when orders did come, they often came too late. Back in his apartment, Caleb sat in darkness. Lights off, curtains drawn, only the faint glow from the street bleeding through. He set the envelope on the table, drumming his fingers against the wood until they dropped limp. The weight of helplessness pressed like stone. Somewhere nearby, a child was asking for help. And now, as before, he was told to stand still. The wind hissed through the window cracks, the sound almost like shellfire in memory. Caleb shut his eyes and the battlefield returned, the locked steel door, children crying behind it, the commander's shout, "Hold position." He jolted awake, sweat slick on his temple. The apartment, dark and narrow, felt like a bunker, silent, suffocating. His eyes found the cane in the corner. For a fleeting moment the thought came, maybe he was just a leftover, a man no one trusted anymore, a voice no one heard. But then, in that stillness, another realization rose. If he surrendered to silence now, that boy's eyes would haunt him for the rest of his life. Caleb drew in a long breath. His chest was still heavy, but steadier. He understood, even if the system turned away, he could not. Walking away would not erase memory, it would only carve the scar deeper. On sleepless nights Caleb sat at his worn wooden desk, yellow lamplight spilling across old newsprint. He combed through public records, forgotten clippings buried at the corners of pages. And then, among hundreds of faces, one name stopped him cold, Tommy Harrington. The article was 2 years old, brief, almost hidden among classifieds. Missing child from Norcross, Georgia. 4 years old. Identifying marks: a small triangular birthmark beneath the right ear. Nervous habit: clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. Caleb leaned close to the faded photograph. The boy in the picture wore a shy smile, his eyes bright yet cautious. What froze him was the small hand fixed on the backpack strap, the exact gesture he had seen behind the bus stop. His chest tightened, as though a rope had cinched around it. Memory collided, the eyes at the bus stop, the trembling three-finger signal. Now all of it aligned with the words before him. The child he had seen was no stranger. He had a name, a history, a family waiting. And he had been missing for 2 long years. He sifted through more clippings. One small-town paper carried a story on the mother, Grace Harrington, a woman who had never stopped searching. Her image blurred but strong, thin face, eyes red-rimmed but steady. Caleb traced the photograph with his finger, imagining the emptiness she endured, realizing his own helplessness earlier was nothing compared to 2 years of waiting. Leaning back, he pressed both hands over his face. Inside his chest, fear and resolve wrestled. Fear that if he delayed, the boy would vanish again, as so many lives had before his eyes. But something else surged: determination. This time he had a lead. The past had left him haunted, but it had also sharpened his instincts to recognize truth. Outside, wind hissed through the trees, yet the silence within Caleb shifted. It was no longer helplessness, but an unspoken order: keep going. The boy could not remain just a name in the old news column. That night, after rereading the old article until the words blurred, Caleb wrote down Grace Harrington's last known address on a scrap of paper. The next morning he set out, cane tapping, down a long road toward a quiet neighborhood. Oaks lined the way, bare-limbed, their fallen leaves crunching underfoot. Each step toward her house pressed heavier on his chest, as if he were walking not to someone else's pain, but into a burden he was about to share. Grace's house was small, paint-peeling, porch sagging. When Caleb knocked, slow footsteps came, and the door cracked open. A woman stood there, her face drawn, eyes swollen red yet burning sharp. Behind her, the walls were plastered with photographs of a boy hugging a teddy bear, laughing in a park, frozen at different ages. The room felt like a shrine built for the child who never returned. Carefully, Caleb pulled out the blurred photo he had taken from a distance, his hand trembling slightly. The image showed the small figure pressed against the bus stop, hand gripping the backpack strap. Grace barely glanced before she broke. A sob erupted, jagged and raw, as if a dam held for 2 years had split open. Her hand shook as she touched the picture, whispering, almost without sound, "Tommy." Caleb lowered himself onto a wooden chair by the door, his chest tightening. He didn't speak, no words would fit. The room filled with her sobs, the tick of a clock, and uneven breaths. Between them, silence carried more weight than promises. The boy in that picture had to be saved, and time was nearly gone. When her crying eased, Grace looked up, eyes rimmed red but fiercer than before. In them Caleb recognized the same fear, the same resolve he carried. They were no longer strangers, but unwilling allies bound to the same end. Outside the window the autumn wind blew hard, spinning leaves into a restless spiral. Caleb watched and understood. By stepping to her door, he had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back. The next morning Caleb drove his old pickup, Grace sitting beside him, clutching a paper envelope filled with photographs and the faded article. The sky hung low and gray, clouds pressing down on the rooftops. Neither spoke on the way. Grace's hands trembled against the envelope, but her eyes were taut with hope, as if the whole weight of 2 years rested on this meeting. The station smelled of old wood and weak coffee. A young officer met them, busy-eyed, distracted. Caleb placed the envelope on the desk, voice rough from restraint. The officer slid the photos out, scanned them, and shook his head. No warrant, no action. His tone clipped, final, like iron doors shutting in their faces. Grace tried to explain, her voice breaking, but the reply didn't change. Procedures, statutes, the demand for concrete evidence all stood as walls. Caleb looked at Grace, her face had gone pale, but her eyes clung to the photo on the table. In them he saw himself years ago, when cold orders had held him still in the smoke of war, watching life slip away while he was told to wait.
They left the building in silence.
The wooden door closed behind with a groan that sounded like a nail driven in.
Outside, light rain began, drops spattering the roof and spreading across the asphalt.
Grace pulled her collar tight, walking quickly.
Caleb followed, each step heavy as if weighted.
In his mind the officer's words echoed, sterile, repeated like the delayed warning sirens of memory.
On the drive back, Caleb's hands clenched the wheel, veins rising against the skin. Anger smoldered deep in his chest. He thought of war, delay meant death, hesitation a sentence. There, every minute mattered. And here, in this place called peace, time and procedure were used to mask silence. When they reached Grace's house, she lingered in the seat. Rain streaked the glass. She turned to Caleb, eyes fierce though wet. She said nothing, but he understood. They could not wait. If the system kept its doors closed, they would have to find another way in. Caleb remained in the truck after she went inside. Rain drummed against the windshield, blurring the view like memory smudged. Inside him anger still burned, but beneath it, a heavier resolve took form, quiet but sharp. He knew this time silence could not be the final answer. Since the day the police shut them out, Caleb spent his afternoons parked across from Lorraine's house. He tracked hours, movements. At first, windows cracked open a sliver, sometimes a small hand clutching the curtain. But as days passed, the gaps vanished. Curtains drawn tight, doors shut firm, silence settling as though no life existed within. He noticed another change. Lorraine carried folders often, sometimes clutching thick brown envelopes. Once he saw her leave the post office, her face strained, urgent. He knew those papers weren't routine errands. Instinct honed from years of reading signs told him she was preparing to take the boy away. Each day tightened the pressure in his chest. Sleep barely came. He sat at his desk, photographs, clippings, and scribbled notes spread like maps of war. Outside, the wind rose in gusts, counting down. Tommy's image haunted him, the trembling hand on the backpack strap, the desperate eyes. Every time it surfaced, fear surged with it, the fear of delay, of losing another innocent life. One morning he watched Lorraine lock the door longer than usual, then lead the boy out. The child's head stayed low, shoes tapping against rain-damp pavement. Caleb's gaze followed them as they entered a storefront downtown, the glass marked Legal and Document Services. A chill spread through him. Back in his apartment, Caleb didn't turn on the light. Street glow cut shadows across the wall, his cane's outline stretching sharp. He stared at it, a vow forming hard inside. If he failed to act, Tommy would vanish from sight, from the town, perhaps from the world entirely. Urgency was no longer abstract. It was real, imminent. The clock was ticking, and Caleb understood there was only one direction left: to move forward. Rain fell steady, drumming against rooftops in a relentless rhythm. Caleb pulled on his worn coat, hood drawn low, and moved toward Lorraine's house. The street lay empty, streetlights smeared in the downpour. In his hand he gripped a small recorder, the earphones wound tight around his wrist like a taut cord. At the house he crouched low, slipping past the damp wooden fence. Rain lashed sideways, soaking his coat, but he ignored it. He set the device beneath the living room window, where a faint glow leaked through the curtains. With the headphones pressed to his ears, at first he heard only rain and wind. Then other sounds bled through, muted voices from within. A woman's whisper, low, deliberate, as if convincing herself more than anyone else, "Tommy doesn't exist. You are Lucas. You belong to me." Caleb froze, every muscle drawn tight. Then came the sobs, muffled and broken, a child's cry held down, trembling in the darkened room. In that instant his whole body went numb. Doubt hardened into fact. It was no longer instinct, no longer suspicion, it was evidence, alive and undeniable. Rain streamed cold over his face, but in his chest something flared hot, fierce. He stayed pressed against the wet siding, listening, the sound of sobs weaving into the whispered chant, again and again. Each note carved deeper into his resolve. On battlefields he had heard cries for help, but there at least he had comrades, orders. Here, in the quiet of a peaceful town, he was alone, and truth had fallen directly into his hands. When a gust rattled the windowpane, Caleb tore the headphones off. His breath came heavy, his grip on the recorder bone white. He knew everything had changed. There was no retreat now, no room for hesitation. He rose, water streaming from his sleeves, but his steps felt steadier than ever. The rain still drove hard, but Caleb walked slowly back toward his old truck, clutching the recorder as if it were proof forged in fire. The night no longer felt like cover but a boundary. Before, there had been doubt; after, there was only action. Rain lashed heavy, striking rooftops like whips. Caleb parked the old truck at the end of the street, headlights off, engine cooling in silence. He checked the recorder, slid it into his coat, and gripped his cane like a weapon. Pain throbbed in his knee, but the memory of Tommy's eyes pushed him forward. Lorraine's house glowed faintly, curtains trembling with the wind. Caleb slipped around back, easing through a window left ajar. The floorboards groaned under his weight, breath quick against the hammer of rain on the roof. In the dim room, a weak lamp cast yellow light across gray walls. In the corner, the boy sat bound, tape across his mouth. His eyes shimmered wet, trembling, and then flared with recognition when they met Caleb's. For an instant, Caleb forgot pain, storm, everything. He lunged forward, crouched by the boy, tearing at the tape over his mouth. Then a scream ripped the room apart. Lorraine burst in, hair wild, a kitchen knife gleaming in her grip. She shrieked, "He's mine!" Her voice tangled with the rain, raw and furious. Caleb swung, pulling the boy behind him. The knife flashed, his cane rose to meet it, metal clanging sharp in the close air. The jolt rattled his arm. Lorraine lunged again, her eyes gone frantic, her mouth repeating denials like incantations. Caleb shoved hard, sending her crashing against the corner wall. The knife clattered, ringing across the wooden floor. He clutched Tommy tight, the boy's small frame shivering against him. Rain hammered the roof like an unending drum. Caleb felt his heart pounding, not in fear but in strength. This was the moment he would not let truth slip away again. The child pressed his face to Caleb's chest, sobs breaking against the storm outside. Caleb held tighter, feeling the fragile warmth, the undeniable proof of life in his arms. Lorraine slumped in the corner, muttering, her words fading. Caleb no longer listened. All he knew was this: in that room, in the storm's heart, he had pulled life back from the edge. Tires screeched outside. Through headlights blurred by rain, Grace rushed from the car, her thin coat no match for the downpour. She called her son's name, voice breaking yet cutting clear through the storm. Tommy lifted his tear-streaked face, then tore free from Caleb's arms and ran straight into hers. His small body collided into her chest, and the sob that burst forth sounded like a dam breaking after years of strain. Grace clutched him tight, fingers trembling as they combed his wet hair, whispering his name again and again, as if to anchor the truth: he was here. Caleb stepped back, silent. He stood beneath the porch as rain lashed across his face, mingling with sweat and the dust of time. His hands still trembled from the struggle, but inside, his heartbeat steadied. Before him, 2 years of absence sealed shut in one embrace. Police cars pulled up, lights flashing red and blue across the soaked pavement. Radios crackled, boots splashed through puddles, but all the noise hovered at the edges. At the center stood only mother and child, bound together in the cold rain. Tonight, one boy had come home, and that was all that mattered. Grace knelt, holding Tommy as if afraid letting go would erase him again. Caleb watched, chest heavy, and turned slightly aside. He knew his part was finished here. His role was never to keep, but to return the boy to where he belonged. An officer approached Caleb, asking quick questions. He nodded faintly, eyes still fixed on mother and son beneath the storm's veil. The noise blurred. What he heard clearly were Tommy's ragged breaths, Grace's broken whispers, and his own heart finally slowing. In that instant, Caleb understood something simple: not all battles bled. Some were fought so a child could cry in his mother's arms, so a mother could breathe again after years of emptiness. And he, lonely figure though he was, had been the bridge for that moment. Weeks passed, the town settling back into its rhythm, but within Caleb something had shifted quietly. He still walked past the bus stop each afternoon, yet now the memory of 3 trembling fingers was replaced by the image of a boy's smile. One bright morning he went to the therapy center where Tommy was receiving help.
The room was filled with children's drawings taped to the walls, crayons scattered across low tables. Caleb stepped in holding a wooden model airplane he had built from scraps in his garage. He handed it to the boy. Tommy reached out, turned the tiny propeller, and then, suddenly, smiled. It was the first smile after so many days of fear. Caleb froze, warmth rising in his chest, as though that light had found its way into his own dark corners. Grace stood nearby, eyes wet yet glowing. She said nothing, only nodded gently. Caleb understood, in this journey, he had returned more than a child, he had restored a mother's faith. Later, when Caleb came back to his apartment, winter was edging in. He opened the door to the familiar silence. But on the table lay a yellow envelope. Inside was a crayon drawing, a soldier standing beside a boy beneath a golden tree. The lines were clumsy, the colors uneven, but it pulsed with life. At the bottom, in careful letters, it read, "Thank you for seeing me." Caleb set the drawing on the table and lowered himself into the chair. He stared at it for a long time, letting the quiet of the room fill with its meaning. No explanation needed, no witnesses required. Just him, the drawing, and the wind sighing through the window frame. In that sound he almost heard a whisper, "Courage isn't always charging into fire, nor deeds meant to echo loudly. Sometimes courage is simply not turning away when a child's eyes plead to be seen." Caleb leaned back, resting both hands on his cane. He breathed slow, deep, and for the first time in years, he felt he could sit without being consumed by the past. Outside, the wind kept moving, leaves skittering down empty streets. And inside him, a door quietly closed only so another might open.